And welcome, everyone. This is another episode of the Mind Sculptors podcast. I am your host, Callahan, and we do have a great show lined up for you all today. But before we get into all of that, I just want to take a moment to thank you all for joining us this week. If you like this episode or any of our other episodes, please make sure to like and subscribe and comment below. It really helps us out. If you want access to our Discord server as well as some extra stuff when we get to it, please make sure to head on over to our Patreon at patreon.com/themindsculptors or check out the link in the description. Today, we are going to be going over some... we're doing another Brewer's Corner episode, and so joining me today is one of the OGs, not only of the Sculpty Boys, but of the format, is my good friend Cobblepott. Cobble, how you doing today?
Doing well. Good to be here.
Yeah, good to have you. Also joining me today is somebody most people in the cEDH community would know, and is somebody who has definitely fostered a lot of the growth in the community, I would say, that has happened over the last 4 or 5 years. Is some might call you the Godfather, is our good friend Shaper. How are you doing today, man?
I'm excellent. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have done the Brewer's Corner episodes a few times in the past, and we decided, Cobble and I, we wanted to take a look at some older commanders that haven't been getting much attention recently. And the commander that we landed on for this episode is, of course, Zur the Enchanter. So we're going to do this a little bit differently than we usually do our Brewer's Corner episodes. And we're going to just take a look at some of these lists here as we go down. And the first one, of course, guests are always first. Start off with Shaper's list here, and it's ZURe quasi-turbo. And Shaper, I know this one for people who are familiar with ZURe on the database. This one probably is the closest to what ZURe on the database looks like of all of our decks, right?
It is. It differs from about 10 cards from the first list on the database.
Okay. So give us a brief overview on this and kind of what's going on with this one.
The high level of ZURe quasi-turbo is that we're going to mull for proactivity, and we're going to settle for early disruption into an eventual ZURe. We are looking to cast an early ad nauseam, as turbo does. We are also willing to sit on our haunches a little bit, wait for people to get disrupted, and hit necropotence with ZURe, which will exert kind of a similar force to an ad nauseam in propelling you into enough card advantage to overall the table and win the game, sometimes in one turn, sometimes over the course of a couple turns. In general, we are trying to find hands that are very impactful early, maybe an early wheel or an early ad nauseam or an early raw necropotence or early draw engines alongside disruption. And we're going to settle for hands that are able to exert a little disruption on turn 1 and 2, play an eventual ZURe, and get us to the win con in the same way. So we're going to be a little relatively conservative in the early turns, unless we have something really exciting to do. We're going to be willing to keep hands full of mana with a little bit of disruption, some stacks, some counterspells. We play a suite of tactful bears that are going to kind of stop the most degenerate things that are going on at most tables. Some efficient counters, and we're playing a few hard counters for the late game in order to make sure that we are able to stop what needs to be stopped while we're taking advantage of the table.
Right. And this is pretty low to the ground. You're not playing stuff like Force of Will. You're not playing stuff like Fierce Guardianship, correct?
I am playing both of those.
The organization on these, excuse me, never mind.
Yeah, it's the mana cost. I have them all set to 0.
Okay.
Just for my own. Sorry about that.
Oh, you're fine. I'm the one who looks obnoxious here.
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
But so you're definitely trying to, be a little bit more proactive. Now, the big thing here with this list, I would say, is what would you say is the big difference between this and the ones that are on the database right now?
This is running a little bit more disruption, a few pieces of tech that I think are quite appropriate for the current meta. It's not running Peer into the Abyss. I think we have enough forward gas that we don't need that, and Peer is a little bit of a struggle to cast without specifically Dockside or some other large mana engine. And we're not trying to play certain pieces of tech that enable peers, such as culling the weak with our low creature count and whatnot. We're kind of filling a lot of those slots with some hardy disruption, a little bit extra ramp, and just a few pieces of spicy tech.
Okay. So when we take a look at sort of some of the more win con pieces of this, right? What are the win cons for this list?
We are all in on Consul and Oracle, Labman, and Jace. Mm-hmm. Thassa's Oracle will be the most efficient of those, and Laboratory Maniac and Jace kind of offer some consistency in finding one of those effects. Say when we're looking through Necropotence cards, they also sit on the board longer than Thassa's Oracle trigger does, so it enables us to have win cons around certain pieces of stacks. Say that only let us cast one spell a turn, or tax our mana to the point where we would need to exert our win con over multiple turns.
Okay. And kind of looking at some of the more key cards for say, right? Like Adnaz is certainly going to be, Necropotence is certainly going to be a key card, right?
Mm-hmm. Also, Adnaz and Necropotence are probably the most key cards of the deck, alongside of our win cons. Also worth highlighting is Chains of Mephistopheles in our enchantment suite. So once you swing ZURe for Necropotence, when you untap with all of your Necropotence cards, you'll have an extra ZURe swing. So you can either use that, for example, to grasp or fade away some stacks that's preventing you from comboing. You can grab Copy Artifact to have a little extra mana on your turn. You can play Mystic Remora as kind of a shield to have some draw over your Laboratory Maniac in the event of Abrupt Decays. There's some tech, but a lot of the times we will want to swing ZURe for Chains and then cast a Wheel, which should strip everybody of their hands and enable us to then take over the game between ZURe and Necropotence. So right. A lot of the focus will be to the very turn after Necropotence, you need to either win the game or close out the game in a lot of ways. And Chains is one of the mechanisms with which you can do that, only needing one extra card on top of Chains, specifically a Wheel.
Right.
So it offers you a little extra consistency in assembling a soft lock with ZURe that will help you close out.
Awesome. That's really cool. I had never thought about Chains in that regard. Looking at some of the more different type of stuff that you're playing in this, I know you're playing, you are who turned me on to Mindbreak Trap, actually. But Mindbreak Trap, Copy Artifact, Mnemonic Betrayal, Lightning Greaves, what are kind of the thoughts with those as kind of your tech from this deck?
Mindbreak Trap is a piece of tech that I think is pretty strong in the current meta, with a lot of people playing strategies that revolve around casting multiple rituals into a large payoff spell like Naws or Peer into the Abyss. Mm-hmm. It lets you importantly tap out for ZURe while still holding up some level of disruption on top of the stack. Force of Will is a pretty strong card, and Mindbreak Trap actually offers a little extra force in being able to exile any number of target spells that can be relevant occasionally in large stack wars, which sometimes are what turn on the Mindbreak Trap, and can let you blow out stacks in ways that give it a little extra oomph, as it were.
Right. And stuff like Lightning Greaves, this is one of the interesting things that we'll touch on later. But you're the only one of the three of us that's playing Lightning Greaves. What's kind of the thought process there?
I'm playing Lightning Greaves in all of the builds I'm going to be talking about today. I think it's a really powerful enabler for ZURe. It lets you kind of it cuts a turn off of how long your ZURe takes to kind of overtake the game. Mm-hmm. And it also, really importantly, doesn't let people remove it after the Greaves are equipped. A lot of people are forgoing creature removal for more flexible interaction, maybe stack interaction to protect their early wins and that sort of thing. So it's becoming more and more rare to see board wipes in cEDH.
Right. That is certainly true.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot less Toxic Deluge. We're seeing Dam as new tech, but only very rarely. It's in a difficult color combination, and its sorcery speed half leaves some some to be desired, but in general, we're seeing people be very greedy on their actual creature removal, which I think benefits ZURe, even in his base case, but even more if you're able to attach a Lightning Greaves to him.
Yeah, for sure. That makes a whole lot of sense, especially from the access of being able to get it going a turn earlier, right? Mm-hmm. The second list you brought first. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was also going to mention that Mindbreak Trap is actually interesting tech alongside Lightning Greaves, because when you swing ZURe with the Lightning Greaves, you will have paid for ZURe's cost, which leaves you with less mana to act disruptively over the turn pass. And so the density of free counters is kind of important if you want to make it back to your turn and not have people win in the interim. So playing Mindbreak Trap and Fierce Guardianship alongside Lightning Greaves actually bolsters your hits in that regard.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Go ahead.
I was actually just going to step in and ask kind of the elephant in the room. So ZURe has been declining in how much play it's been seeing in the metagame for several years. And, if you talk to one person, they'll say, oh, it's because if you want to play fast, if you want to play the fast game, then you need to have access to red. Or, if you want to be able to race whatever is happening at the table, you need to be playing Cody, or you need to be, doing something that doesn't require you to get 3 mana and a haste enabler onto the battlefield before you, quote unquote, do your thing. How do you feel about ZURe within the context of the current meta, the way that people have been thinking about ZURe for 5 years?
I think ZURe's decline in popularity is more about what's in vogue than anything about ZURe itself. I think ZURe is quite strong as he stands right now. I do think there's some accuracy in saying that it's difficult to consistently race red decks without red yourself. But I do think that we have enough tools to be disruptive. And I also think that people aren't not playing those tools themselves. And so having the fastest decks run into counter walls or encourage people to deck construct around them and stop them proactively, I think benefits things like ZURe, where we not only have the fast-ish ad nauseam plan ourselves, but we also have the ZURe and wait plan, which we can put on the board multiple times, and people are not really intending to interact with that as much as they are intending to interact with quick spell casts, dockside, and that sort of thing in general. So I think there's some good room to trip the person who's running fastest and win the race herself.
Right. And I think that just it needs to be underscored that.
And I tried to underscore that with the title here. We're calling this ZURe quasi-turbo. We're not the most turbo deck at the table, but we are going very fast. And we kind of have to play appropriately, and you have to think about your deck in that manner.
Right. 5 years ago, ZURe would have been, yes. Like 5 years ago, ZURe would have been a fast deck because of the tools that were available in the meta. Mm-hmm. And the way that we approach ZURe just needs to incorporate the changes that we've seen in that time. And we just kind of need to adopt a new frame for how it is that we're thinking about approaching ZURe.
Well, and that's kind of the rationale for this entire episode, right? Like, yeah, we look at it, and I think this is one of the things that are more interesting is I feel like a lot of the lists that we see generally for ZURe tend to be working on one of two axes, in my opinion. And they tend to be working either on this axis of using more of that old school approach that we used to see with the shimmer lines and all those different things, which I am on record for saying that I actually still think shimmer lines are fine. It's just we need to find a different way of making them work. But so you have that going on, but then you also have the decks that feel like they should be Timna Malcolm decks that are ZURe decks, and I don't feel like they're getting the most out of their builds. Is that like a fair thing to say in your opinion? Or I
personally would find it hard to be attracted to Timna Malcolm over ZURe. I'll just say that straightforwardly. Swinging ZURe is a lot more powerful than swinging a creature with Tymna, and that's just where I would personally prefer to be. I do think you have your tools are a little more distributed when you're playing Tymna Malcolm, and that enables you to like have some resiliency. Where if people are determined to just answer your ZURe over and over again, you might rather be playing Tymna Malcolm. But I think if I'm showing up to a new pod, I would rather just play ZURe.
Right. Well, it's interesting. So we talked about your philosophy with wanting to use ZURe to be a little bit more disruptive. So that brings us to our next list that we're going to be looking at here. And that is probably the most disruptive of all of the ZURe lists we're going to be talking about today, and that is ZURe stax. And so looking at this list, just kind of give us the overview of it. What's the overview of what this deck is doing?
So we are looking to be disruptive first. We're looking at what people are doing in the meta right now that puts out the fastest clock, which is dockside ad nauseam, storming really quickly, wheels, that sort of thing. And we are looking to see how we can play a high density of pieces that disrupt them, play ZURe out eventually once people are sufficiently slogging through your stax pieces, or we're going to swing for Necropotence, which will offer us card advantage, some counters, that sort of thing, and usually is what lets you take over the game. You're generally not swinging for stax pieces first. And then we're kind of riding our ZURe through the rest of the game, plugging up the holes that our opponents are kind of able to escape through. And then eventually winning the game with a combo that we're able to tutor off ZURe completely, which is Heliod and Ballista, which we can get with Artificer's Intuition.
Which is interesting that you're going for this win con. You're not playing Thoracle. You do have Labman in this.
Thoracle is shut off by a lot of our pieces. It doesn't really like to see Rule of Law, which we are hardlining. I think we have 6 copies in here. It's
quite a few.
You are able to play through a Rule of Law with specifically Tainted Pact and Thassa's Oracle. But it's just kind of easier to play around your Labman and also focus on this 0 card combo out of the command zone. You're really focused on trying to resolve and protect ZURe all the way to victory in this build, more so than the other builds where if ZURe gets removed, you still have some really strong game independent plans, which we do have here. But I think your slots here are more focused on disruption, and you'll dirtle a little bit without your ZURe.
Right. Now you do have a card in here that I think is very interesting, and is we talked about board wipes, and nobody's playing board wipes. Well, you're playing one of my new favorite board wipes, is Winds of Abandon. And so for the people at home who have looked at this card and go, well, why do we want to give our opponents lands? Explain the thought process behind this over something like Dam.
So the primary thing here is that we don't want to wipe our hate bears, which are really important for stopping everyone. So we're kind of looking at asymmetrical board wipes, which would be mostly Cyclonic Rift and Winds of Abandon in our colors. We do need to kind of clear out creatures. It's kind of an important thing for us to do because of reliance on life total with Necropotence specifically. And also in the meta right now, a lot of the most aggressive decks that people are playing are forgoing basics, mostly because Dockside helps you skirt around meta denial pieces that would normally hose you if you don't play basics. And thus people are cutting those non-basic hate pieces. And it's kind of a self-reinforcing cycle. So people are not really worried about that. They're trying to be greedy on their colors and whatnot. So we're not really worried too much about them pulling out lands. We're also, in general in this build, it is a stax build, but it's not really trying to mana deny. I'm not playing very many mana denial pieces, if any at all, in here. And we're mostly trying to restrict people's lines that they're playing via Rule of Law or things like Counterbalance or Exile via Rest in Peace. We're really trying to choke out their lines and options more so than their mana.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I am going to go on the record and say that I think that this is probably one of the most underrated cards in the meta right now. In the 4 games that I've got to resolve this card, I have won all 4 of them. It is quite strong. I think the Exile ability overloaded, I think is very undervalued. But that is, That's how I feel about it. But so when you look at some of the more key cards, obviously we've got those pieces. You're playing the full suite of rule of law effects. Any other key cards that we should keep an eye out in this list?
So we were playing Counterbalance and Sensei's Divining Top, which together form not quite a soft block, but the ability to counter any kind of repeated spell casts, deny people value engines, essentially for free, if for every time we can line up a hit. It also pairs really well with Necropotence to have a counterbalance in play, because if you know that your top card doesn't match, you can just exile it with Necropotence and perhaps even dig deeper on your top underneath that. We're also playing Chains of Mephistopheles for we have a wheel in the deck to do these soft lock strip, but we're also just trying to passively deny, say, partner draw from Timna Krom and Thrasios, which Chains is fairly good at doing. We've got Grasp of Fate. We're running that in most ZURe decks, but we really need to shut off things that pour out too much advantage, or stax pieces that shut us off. Sometimes no rods can be awkward for ZURe.
Right.
Chalice of the Void and Sanctum Prelate, I think, are really good choices, particularly with the saturation that some of us are seeing with Cody in the metagame.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And how dependent Cody is on resolving one CMC spells.
We've also got a pretty extensive package of artifacts that we were able to tutor with some combination of Artificer's Intuition and Urza's Saga. Ballista being the win con that kind of exists in that sphere. Also finding Chalice, which can hose a lot of different strategies in a lot of different ways, and we're pretty equipped to play around it with the way that ZURe pulls in enchantments. I'm running Pithing Needle. I think it's very important for a deck like this to be able to shut off specifically Thrasios and Kenrith abilities. They're one of
Jessica.
Also Jessica. There are just some activated ability commanders that pose difficulty for us in the late game with how much draw they're able to put out, and we kind of need to stem the bleeding somewhat there. Needle's an okay way to do that. You might forgo the needle if you're not facing down that specifically. We've got Grafdigger's Cage, which works against Breach and also works against the really strong green tutors that pull in creatures directly. We've got top counterbalance, obviously. The Artificer's Intuition finds the top, as it were. And we've got, mana we can pull in, I guess, as well. And that kind of constitutes the Artificer's Intuition toolbox.
I'm just going to say it. I love this list so much. Artificer's Intuition is so hot. I love this card in this.
It's also very easy to pay for its cost of discarding an artifact when you have so many cards rolling in off Necropotence.
Right.
So basically, you get Necropotence first. You plug whatever hole must be plugged with maybe your second ZURe swing. Then you put the Artificer's Intuition on the board, and you can plug whatever holes you need to plug with that. And then you have Heliod to either pad your life with Necropotence or win the game when you're ready.
Yeah, this is such a cool list. Looking at our next list, we are moving over now to Cobblepott, and your list kind of takes a similar approach in some regards, while also being a little bit more of a reanimator deck. And you've teased this on Twitter about ZURe, and I'm just going to go ahead and say the name of the deck. We're doing Raz-cats or Raz-cats.
Raz-cats,
that makes more sense.
Yeah.
So Cobble, give us a little bit of an overview of this. What are we doing here in this?
All right, this is sort of straddling a balance between stacks and more mid-range kind of action. So the idea is that you aren't trying to get ZURe out as fast as you can. You're not trying to race the table. You're trying to play conservatively and disrupt the table. Mm-hmm. And that's mainly going to be through things that are, attacking the hand, like Chains of Mephistopheles. I've been very happy with Blind Obedience, just particularly against Dockside and particularly against post-Nost or post-Necro, fast mana. And it also doubles as a way to gain life to be able to stay buoyant when you do have a Necropotence in play. I got Rule of Law effects in here, but the only rule of law effects that I have are creature oriented, so that when you get Raz-cats into play, you can sacrifice them to Raz-cats and then not be under the same restrictions to be able to combo off in that moment. But it's running both the Oracle Consult package and the Heliod Ballista package, just depending on how much mana you have access to and what the circumstances of what the table texture are. The being able to go fast and low versus more slow and more methodical is having that flexibility is very useful. Let's see here. The reanimation part is really nice, just because there's so many cheap enchantments that offer you that ability. So you can entomb or unmarked grave a consecrated sphinx or notion thief or Raz-cats or Elish Norn, depending on the circumstances, and then just swing with ZURe to be able to get them into play without casting a spell, and just be able to value people out of the game if the circumstances are such that you can't just win on the spot.
Right.
So it's got a lot of flexibility. It's got a lot of interaction, and it is not going to race the table, but it will be able to grind very well through the long game.
Right. So when we're looking at this, what are some of the key pieces of this list? Like you said, it is running the some of these creature-based rule of law effects, similar to how regular Raz-cats has that ability to sack your collector oof to come back to your combo, right?
Right. And this is doing very much the same thing. I think Shaper's absolutely right that the first thing that you get with your ZURe swing is generally going to be Necropotence, just to keep your hand full. And then after that, you start placing the things that are most needed to be able to disrupt what's going on. Right. In a lot of cases, that's going to be rule of law. So you're going to go and get your Eidolon of Rhetoric and try to protect that on the table. Getting the Chains of Mephistopheles with a wheel is also really good, especially since we're on reanimation. So we can strip everybody's hand and then get ourselves a new hand, and then still swing with ZURe to be able to grab whatever we want out of the graveyard or anybody else's graveyard. So there's a lot of flexibility to be able to make lines emerge kind of in a free kind of non-rote way. So the way a lot of the really fast decks play, it's very programmatic almost, because they're very repetitive in the lines that you see. This is very free. So if you're able to think on your feet, there's a lot of different things you can put together that people might not see coming. Right.
You mentioned that blind obedience was kind of your hot tech that you're really high on in this. Any reason in your mind that blind obedience shouldn't be in maybe more lists, or what are your kind of thoughts on blind obedience overall?
I feel like blind obedience doesn't get the play that it should. It only disrupts for a single turn, as things are coming down. But most of the ways that people win are, they are not, accumulated over a certain amount of turns. A lot of people will win very quickly by either, throwing down a dockside or, casting an ad naus and then throwing down all their mana and then going off. So being able to stop people from doing that, it winds up being sort of a rule of law in effect in some ways that can also keep your life high enough for you to be able to, be out of the red zone.
Right.
So, Cobble, I see that you have 3 primary reanimation targets here. You have Raz-cats, Elesh Norn, and Consecrated Sphinx. Could you tell us a little bit about why you chose these 3 specific targets?
Right. So Raz-cats is, the obvious one, just because the idea is this is a hate bear list for the most part. So there's always going to be fodder for you to feed to Raz-cats to be able to put together a win. Generally an A+B win condition. And Raz-cats also allows you, like I said before, to be able to remove rule of law kind of things that would keep you from being able to cast more than one spell, for instance, Demonic Consultation and Thassa's Oracle. Elesh Norn is phenomenal for games where there's either, another stax player, or there's people playing Timna or Najila, or a ton of. There's a lot of decks that just cannot do what they need to do through an Elesh Norn on the table.
It's also just a Cobblepott classic too, right? Like,
yeah, it's a very useful card, and as the way that Shaper had specified, that there is a very very small presence of board wipes that we're seeing, and there's a lot of important cards like Opposition Agent and Notion Thief and Grand Abolisher and Voidwalker and all of these different cards that just disappear and are no longer a problem if in perpetuity, as long as Elesh Norn is on the table. So, and given the way that it stymies very specific commanders, it's very useful to be able to choose that with an Entomb and be able to just put it right onto the battlefield.
Right.
As far as Consecrated Sphinx goes, this is it's just gonna give you cards just consistently, and even if there is a rule of law, so the other card generation that we have is Rhystic Study and Mystic Remora and Esper Sentinel. All of those things are dependent on the tempo of the game. And if you've got a rule of law going on, then those cards are going to underperform than what you would see compared to just a non-rule of law, everybody going as fast as they can kind of a table. So Consecrated Sphinx is a good contrast to those types of card advantage, just because it's going to draw you, 2 cards for every single player, every rotation. And if you grab a wheel or something like that, it's even better. So it allows you to be able to blend the types of card advantage that you're getting out of the game.
So one card that I might gravitate away from in this list, and I'm curious how you're intending to use it, would be Wishclaw Talisman. In these kind of longer games, it's difficult to let other people tutor. Can you tell us a little bit about how you plan to use Wishclaw?
So generally, the Wishclaw is to get a specific card that in a lot of cases, it's to get protection. So like only in the case where you don't have a rule of law in play, or you've got your Raz-cats, you've just had Raz-cats come up and you've sacrificed a couple of hate bears to him to assemble a win, and then you maybe only have one piece of interaction in your hand to protect the combo. Wishclaw Talisman is just an extra pair of it's an extra interaction piece that costs 1 mana basically. So you just for 1 mana go and find your Fierce Guardianship or Impact of Negation as an extra layer of protection on the turn that you're trying to go off.
Yep. I also see that you can grab your Opposition Agent as well. So it does have some really disruptive uses that don't give your opponent like a really truly useful Wishclaw Talisman.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I really like this list. I gotta tell you, you're running Swords to Plowshares, and that's the good news. Because evidently people have decided that Swords isn't good anymore.
They're wrong.
Absolutely, I agree with you there. So the next card or deck we're going to talk about here is actually my deck. which is ZURe rector. Anybody who's been following me for any amount of time on Twitter or in the Discord servers that we're around in is that I have been doing a lot of brewing around the two rectors of Academy Rector and Arena Rector. I think they have very powerful effects. And I think it's very similar to a lot of what Cobble talked about, because it works the same way of, hey, I have an unmarked grave, I have a ZURe, and I can assemble a combo. So there's a couple things with this, right? So your overall game plan is we're trying to reanimate a arena rector or, you know, some form of a Thassa's Oracle or something like that, and then win with a consult. Academy Rector in this is less good as it is in green-based decks where you're able to layer stuff with Pattern of Rebirth, which is a big knock, I would say, against it, but it does have a lot of utility in being able to grab other enchantments that we want, as well as being kind of like acting as like a double ZURe almost. The biggest thing with this is, I think the weirdest card I'm probably running is, I don't know, I'm probably going to get questions about this, is Sorin Vengeful Bloodlord. And that acts as a second, it's really there for the density of reanimate spells. We generally are going to be using that to reanimate something much smaller. And it's also has some utility in that it's +1 is able to remove some creatures that might be bothering us on the board, help tempo out, also gain us a little bit of life. It's not a lot, but it matters, especially when you're on a Necropotence plan. We do run Necropotence. So far with this list, it's been an interesting deck to play. It plays very differently than my other Rector lists. But it has been very fun to play so far. I'm sure you guys have questions about the way I built the list.
My main question is, generally when you see creature oriented plans, you expect green to be part of the picture just because of survival of the fittest and all of the green tutor capacity with Eldritch Evolution, Neoform, all those kinds of things. What sorts of tools do you have to help you be more consistent in getting one of your rectors?
Well, we're playing stuff like Recruiter of the Guard. Recruiter of the Guard ends up being a direct tutor to both of the rectors in this situation. It also is able to get sack outlets, which is very important. We also run we run all the tutors that we can run, as well as like Diabolic Intent, which acts as like a sack outlet on its own. Running Unmarked Grave, Entomb, all those sorts of things, including Wishclaw Talisman, where usually kind of in the same sense with Cobble, where if we're using Wishclaw Talisman, we're probably using it to attempt to do either a win or something quite powerful with it.
I really like the inclusion of Wandering Archaic.
Yeah.
I wanted to try to keep that card in my list, but I think that I would need to be a little bit more in on Rule of Law to qualify it, just because of how well Archaic works with a Rule of Law on the battlefield, giving you kind of, in effect, as many counter spells as everybody else has, in addition to whatever spell it is that you want to be able to cast. I wish that card saw a little bit more play, and I like to see it here.
I like it here. I like it in all of my Rector lists because it, in the ones with green, it ends up being like a Neoform target, right? Because you can Neoform one of your Rectors into an Archaic. and which is really nice. The other thing that I like for it with rector-based strategies is it lets you kind of have a little bit of extra protection when you're trying to do those things. It doesn't stop opposition agent, but it can let you, if you're trying to point removal at an opposition agent, be able to double up on some of the counter magic that might be pointed at your removal spell. So I've been a big fan of Wandering Archaic. I know that I wasn't a fan of it originally.
Mm-hmm. Everybody can change.
Yeah,
I can change. You can change.
You can tell Ethan I've ate my shorts, or Ian that I've eaten my shorts. So I have done that. But yeah, this has been a fun list. I've been really enjoying playing around with rector builds recently. It's been really neat to experiment with them.
What would you say are your most tutored targets with Academy Rector?
With Academy Rector, it honestly depends on what the board texture is looking like. Usually what I'm getting with that is something that is going to be a piece of redundancy to some extent. So we've got like stuff like Copy Artifact, which can play that role sometimes. I also really like Grasp of Fate and Rhystic Study. And of course, Counterbalance. So, and once I kind of get those things moving, Academy Rector ends up being better. And it's also important to note that if your ZURe gets removed, it allows you to still do some of your ZURe stuff if ZURe's not around. So if you can't afford to be casting into ZURe over and over, recast it, wait a turn, you still have Academy Rector there to help you get some of your reanimation targets rolling. So it ends up helping with that. So it just kind of depends on what's going on the board, really. Which sounds super like I'm not giving you a real answer, but
I mean, I feel like
everything's contextual,
right? It seems really nice. So the pattern of play that a lot of these lists are having is you get your ZURe into a place where he can swing and still be protected, and you get your Necropotence, and then you wait a rotation, and then you get something else to forward your game plan. And having the option of doing two things on that turn as opposed to just one, going and getting the Necropotence and getting Chains of Mephistopheles, or, going and getting the Necropotence and Counterbalance, or whatever it is that is going to help you to be able to oppress what it is that people are doing on the board. I mean, that seems fairly useful.
What tech would you say is just on the fringe of you being willing to put in here? Is there anything stand out that just almost quite makes the build? Any rector targets?
There are. So I've actually fiddled around with Omniscience quite a bit in this one. And this actually, because originally in my Thrasios Timna build with that, I had Omniscience and Enter the Infinite in that build. And that ended up coming out, and I tested it in this list a little bit. I might put it back in to give Rector a little bit more, Academy Rector a little bit more legs. But Omniscience is one of those weird cards where I've just had so many experiences where I've drawn it, and then you just kind of are like, well, hope I get Brainstorm. You're just like, all right, well, this is fun. And you never want to be in a position, especially in a deck like this, where you are actively tutoring for Brainstorm. And that's kind of why I cut it from my other lists, too, because you just kind of get in a position where you are actively trying to get the card in your hand, not into your graveyard, but back into your library, which is hard. So it's kind of on the fringe of it. I also think Liliana Death's Majesty is another card that one could argue is a little bit better than Sorin in this. My experience with Sorin has been that it's a little bit more agreeable to hard cast than Liliana. Being 4 mana versus 5 mana I think is important. And I think having redundancy for you can tell I played a lot of Sidisi Brood Tyrant because I layer everything.
I'd wonder about adding Smothering Tithe as a way to help support those situations where Omniscience gets stuck in your hand or something like that. Because I don't think there's ever a time that you've got a Smothering Tithe and you're lacking mana. So
it's true.
One spicy piece of tech that I'll half sell you on. I just want to point out an interesting line. If you play Oblivion Ring with ZURe, if you're able to animate dead, say a rector, you can Oblivion Ring the animate dead to sacrifice it. I've been trying to think if there's any sacrifice enchantments that you can swing for, but I'm sure you've looked and there doesn't seem to be very many.
Yeah, I've done fair because there's like O-Ring and then there's another one. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. There's two.
Detention Sphere. Yeah,
that's it. And I think it's nice, but I think ultimately it feels a little bit, in my opinion, like I feel like I'd rather play something that isn't as it feels loose, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
Here's another piece of tech that does the same thing as Oblivion Ring. Aura of Silence. That's a throwback.
Oh god.
Yes.
You can Aura of Silence sack to destroy your Dance of the Dead and kill your Rector.
That's hilarious.
Just
actually,
food for thought.
You might have sold me on that. That's hilarious. I dig that so much.
You could run Attrition.
I am under no false ideas that this deck is like great or anything for what it's worth. I think it's fun to play, and I think it was like it's kind of been my ongoing experiment with the shell to kind of see where it works, which has been a fun experiment. But
Contamination might also be an interesting one.
I'm also looking at Aura Flux at the beginning of your upkeep. Sacrifice enchantments unless you pay 2.
Ooh. That's fun.
That's probably not. I mean, it does actually let you like sacrifice your enchantments with ZURe, but we're probably playing too much too many important enchantments. But
yeah.
But on to the next list. We've got several here. Is another list here from Shaper, and this is kind of a different one from what we've seen so far. And this is ZURe Turns. And so tell us a little bit about ZURe Turns here, Shaper.
So this is clearly the spiciest build that I've brought to the table today.
I just want to spoil one thing. Trade Routes is in this freaking deck for crying out loud.
So Trade Routes is kind of the central motivating card here. It is an enchantment that allows you to pay 1 to bounce a land. And what we're doing with that is we're using Mystic Sanctuary to continue taking turns with our enchantments. And as you might realize with ZURe, pulling a couple enchantments out quickly ends the game. So if you're able to establish a turn loop, it's pretty easy to close the game out with, say, the Heliod combo that we've been running, or manually assembling a console, or anything like that. This list is sort of inspired by both some things that are going on in mono blue brewing and Paco, actually. It's kind of in a similar zone where like Paco or ZURe kind of acts as your card advantage engine, and you're going to play disruptively around it and then take some extra turns, which should yield you so much value that you just win the game. And it'll be difficult for your opponents to decide whether or not they must counter your turn spells, because it's kind of difficult to want to counter just an extra turn when, somebody could be casting something much scarier.
Right. So take me through some of this list, because this list is a trip. I'm telling you, I love this list. You're, of course, doing the Heliod Ballistas thing, but you're also doing some stuff with Trade Routes. Specifically, man, couldn't get that word out of my mouth. Specifically, you're doing stuff with Trade Routes and trying to loop Mystic Sanctuary, correct?
Yep, that's correct. Yeah, the motivating idea here is to play disruptively until you are able to get your ZURe down, kind of take control of the game. Once you have a ZURe in play, if you're able to cast a turn, you should usually be able to kind of close things out. Right. One of the big gates here to this strategy is that you do need an excess of islands. So we're playing a couple extra ones to bolster that. Maybe just one extra one is all we can really afford. But yeah, essentially that's the main plan.
And then looking at like some of the more spicier pieces of this list, like what are kind of some of the tech that people might look at and tilt their heads at?
It may not be obvious, but there's a little tension here with the strategy in which you're trying to take extra turns, but your Necropotence prevents you from having a draw step to then draw your say a card that you've put on top of Mystic Sanctuary. Mm-hmm. And so Necropotence may have not already come out yet at that point, or you may stumble into some awkward timings in which you need to draw your turn. And we're going to do that with Dress Down, probably the highest value enchantment that draws a card. So that's a piece of tech that has a really specific purpose that might not be obvious. We're also playing Baral and Sapphire Medallion, which are kind of unusual choices, but they help us get our turn out and also help us ramp to ZURe. Also, blue cards are abundant here.
Dress Down as a cantrip off ZURe. I love it. Yeah.
Very unfortunately, it doesn't work with Labman, but we're doing our best to work around that and some other brews I'm working on. Anyway, but yeah, things are mostly straightforward here. There's not too much spicy tech that will make you turn your head besides the whole turn plan and right. Some of the accessories here. There's a fairly high level of card quality in this build, I would say.
Yeah. So you're still doing ad nauseum. You're still on intuition. You're still on all that good stuff. You're still, of course, playing the ultimate ZURe land of Urza's Saga. Yep. And so, Cobble, what are your kind of thoughts on this list as we're looking through it?
I think that it looks really interesting. Any list that's running, Baral and Sapphire Medallion to be able to get to that 5 mana more quickly. That just kind of warms my cockles, and I think that it's a really interesting take because it's not a direction that is obvious for ZURe, and I think that that's kind of what's beautiful about this list is that it is just taking one card, Trade Routes. And how can we use this to create an engine that we can exploit? And it's very clever. And it's one of those things where, yes, it's kind of memey, but it looks, I haven't played it, but it on paper, it looks like it can actually get there and do the thing.
One other spicy interaction I kind of want to point out is that Trade Routes can bounce your Urza's Saga, which can let you continue making tokens. So in some stax games, there may be a scenario in which making extra constructs will help you close out the game. Just a dream of mine, but perhaps.
So looking at our next list, this is another list that's I'm personally very excited about. Is Cobble's second list that we're going to be looking at today, and that's Zerbag. So take us through. We've got some more Shadowbag check here. Take us through this list, and for some of the people who might not be familiar with Shadowbag, what it's trying to do and all that.
Sure. So this is just more of a meme than anything else, but the idea was to apply the Shadowbag apparatus to ZURe, since ZURe is very central around Necropotence. Shadowbag is something that was designed to increase the conversion rate of post-Necro wins during the end step. So rather than one of the canonical uses of Necropotence where people just they necro for a lot and then play an extra turn spell, or, wait for the next turn with a, very strong 7 or something like that. It instead uses instant speed reanimation along with discard outlets, Bone Miser, and cards like Shadow of the Grave and Bag of Holding that allow you to return to your hand all cards that have been discarded this turn. So the idea is you get into a situation where you Necropotence for 30, and then either you've got Bone Miser out, or you discard Bone Miser and then reanimate him. And then even if you don't have a discard outlet, you can just go to your end step and then discard all the things and hold priority while the Necropotence triggers for exiling all those things have gone off, and then draw a whole bunch of cards, get a whole bunch of mana, cast Shadow of the Grave to bring all those cards back up to your hand, and then continue going. And in some cases, you either just exhaust your entire library doing that, or you just put together an Oracle and one of the consultations. And Corpse Dance is one of those things that you have so much black mana when the engine's doing the thing that it's like you have infinite black mana basically. So Corpse Dance allows you to arbitrarily put any creatures you want, from your library basically onto the battlefield, because you discard them and then reanimate. So being able to put Oracle onto the battlefield is, just as simple. So we're running, this is also doing a reanimation package kind of thing. So being able to put Bone Miser directly onto the battlefield is easier if we can reanimate it in some cases, rather than doing some of the other hoops towards actually hard casting it, or doing the instant speed reanimation.
Right.
But we also have Consecrated Sphinx and Vilis, Broker of Blood. Vilis is excellent in this capacity, just because we tend to have an abundance of black mana when we're doing the thing, and it's tremendous value when Vilis is just on the battlefield and you're just picking off individual creatures.
Yeah.
But if you've got a whole bunch of, you discard 3 lands and get 6 mana and then turn that into 12 cards, then it very, very easily snowballs, and it is not hard to put together a win in those circumstances.
Right. One of the fun things with this list that I think is so beautiful is Urza Saga is a direct tutor to your Bag of Holding in this list too.
Mm-hmm. That is one of the things that it does. It also Chains of Mephistopheles acts. So the way that you use Bone Miser, either you have a discard outlet, or you use an end step, similar to Gitrog sculpting, or you can use Chains of Mephistopheles as well, because Chains of Mephistopheles will give you the discard as a replacement effect over your draw, and those things will actually chain. So if you discard a card and then you get a draw from your Bone Miser, that draw is then replaced with a discard and then another draw, which allows you to continue feeding cards and not actually needing to have a specialized or specific discard outlet. And so you're getting the benefits of having Chains of Mephistopheles in a disruptive context, but it's also allowing you to combo off too.
I love it. What a spicy engine.
I'm going to just call that Get Sans Green Gitrog now.
Right.
That just...
So would you say that this build is much more, say, air quotes, shimmer oriented than most of these other ZURe builds?
It could be. I mean, it could definitely run. It's not running Shimmer ZURe, but it could, just because it wants to go so deep on the necros, because it really is one of those where you either want to wheel with Notion Thief or do a really deep necro or get Villain onto the battlefield and get a whole bunch of cards. One of those. Go ahead.
Sorry, one piece of tech that might be more middling in that way. Scout's Warning, I think, is something that I was looking at when I was thinking about ZURe's potential Shimmer here. It's a cantrip for white. It draws a card, and it lets you play a creature as though it had flash. You can either use it to flash in ZURe end step, or you can use it during your Necropotence turns to most specifically put a Thassa's Oracle onto the board. But also, if you're able to sneak out your Bone Miser into your eventual cleanup step draw with Bone Miser, I think that that might be a pretty powerful engine to let you go for more end step lines.
Yeah, that's actually really cool. I wouldn't have considered that card in this context.
See, you've got to see some on the fly brewing as we're doing this episode.
Yeah, I see you've got Shallow Grave, which works with an instant speed and tomb and a lot of other things here. So I think this build is like pretty close to being able to shimmer a little harder than, say, these other builds that aren't really building around that.
Right. So the last deck that we're going to take a look at here today is Shaper's all-in consult shift divining witch. It's running them all. So you're calling this consult shift ZURe. So break this deck down a little bit for us.
So this is kind of an amalgamation of a lot of different ideas that went into the other builds. This is the build I'm probably most excited about and would most likely look to play myself. We're a little bit more disruptive than the ZURe quasi-turbo deck. We're playing a few extra hate bears. We're playing countertop, a few other things. I guess the spicy thing about this build is that we're playing specifically Paradigm Shift and Divining Witch as extra mechanisms to exert a consult combo when we're looking at Necropotence cards. So the extra consult density is actually really valuable as you take that one extra turn in order to seal out the game in a way that I think the other build, it doesn't struggle to close out, but there is just less access to Tainted Pact and Consult in those builds than I think what's going on here. One of the important interactions here is that what Paradigm Shift does is it removes all the cards in your library from the game and shuffles your graveyard into your library. If you're able to combine that with a ZURe swinging for Rest in Peace, it just becomes 2 mana empty your library.
Right.
Also, this build is very equipped to it both plays a Deafening Silence itself, but it's also very equipped to play around Rule of Law with Laboratory Maniac in the build. And so Divining Witch basically allows us to use a creature activated ability and basically consult out without actually casting a spell, either by using our draw step or casting a single Thassa's Oracle. It also kind of layers with the Lightning Greaves that we have in the build as well. That's come up a few times and has been quite spicy. A few things that are really not obvious about Divining Witch that I find really interesting is that it is a 1-card combo itself. So once your Divining Witch comes off Summoning Sickness or you equip Lightning Greaves to it, you can find Thassa's Oracle on an end step, untap, and play the Thassa's Oracle. And if it resolves, you can then activate your Divining Witch in response and mill out your library. So it itself finds the Oracle that it wins with, which I think is a pretty interesting property of it. And the other thing is that what's happening right now is we're ending up seeing a lot of creatures that exert some kind of rattlesnake disruptive force. So, I would say Ranger Captain of Eos is one of them that's really popular right now. The new Malevolent Hermit is another that they just kind of sit on the board and people can't quite combo into them because you can't counterspell their activation. They just kind of sit there and stare at you, and that lets you grind a little bit. So Divining Witch actually exerts some similar force there, where if you are holding up a Divining Witch activation, with a little bit of politicking and some resolve and some really tactful use of it, you can threaten to stop people's wins. And so it's a little harder to just kind of combo into the Divining Witch in the same regard. Right. So it exerts a little bit of a disruptive force there too.
It feels almost similar to how Hermit Druid plays in a way.
Mm-hmm. It also layers very well with Hermit Druid. As a little bit of foreshadowing.
Oh boy.
Foreshadowing.
Yeah, well, I'm looking to publish some builds soon.
Oh boy. Be on the lookout, everybody. So now just kind of taking a moment here of looking kind of a broad strokes at all of our lists together here. In looking at the Planeswalkers that we're all playing, only 2 of the lists are playing Planeswalkers. The ZURe quasi-turbo list is playing Jace, and ZURe rector is playing Jace and Sorin. Obviously, we've kind of explained those. They're win cons and Sorin layers with a lot of that stuff. Looking at the creatures here, creatures that we're all playing, is Dothy Voidwalker, Drannith Magistrate, and Esper Sentinel. And Cobble, if you want to, speak for a moment on how we're all playing that and why those are just uniquely good cards that should probably be in every deck that we're doing along these lines, right?
Sure. So Esper Sentinel is often compared to a Mystic Remora. It's not the same effect, but it winds up dovetailing very well with Heliod, and it winds up just accruing a ton of value. And the fact that it doesn't have an upkeep cost is, it's one of those cards that it was evaluated positively when it was first.
But we still under-evaluated it.
Yes.
I didn't. I was preaching it as the best card of the set. Sorry, Pongo and Ravagon, but...
It definitely outshined the expectations.
Yeah.
So it's just one of those things where if you play blue, you play Mystic Remora. If you play white, you should probably play Esper Sentinel. There's really very few circumstances where you wouldn't. Drannith Magistrate is just the same. For lists that require access to their commanders, like ZURe, having a Drannith Magistrate is just another layer of stipulation that you need to get through before you can get to your game plan. And it also disrupts people who are on Breach and Yogg-Will and various other types of strategies that are looking to cast things that aren't necessarily in hand, like Praetor's Grasp and so on. So it's just a very threatening card because it is highly disruptive in it's asymmetric. So it doesn't affect you. And that's one of those things that I think just pushes it way, way over the top. And Voidwalker is one of those, it's a new addition, and each of our lists is approaching it kind of in a different way. There some of the lists that are, looking at Chains of Mephistopheles and trying to, maybe do a wheel and strip everybody's hand and that kind of thing. Voidwalker does. Voidwalker only cares that cards are going into people's graveyards. It doesn't care how it gets there, if it gets milled there, if it gets discarded, or if someone casts a spell. And it just winds up being so good just because someone's going to play something that's worthwhile. And in a lot of cases, maybe it's a counter spell, or maybe it's an ad nauseam, or, it's just so flexible. The longer it sits on the table, the more powerful it becomes. And specifically, if people are weaponizing hand, control, it gets just that much better. But I think that even if you're not, it's just a very strong card that isn't on everyone's radar just yet.
Right.
It also pairs really well with Chains.
Yes.
Yeah, it does. That's funny. So, Shaper, when you're looking at this, you've got some lists, some cards that are a little bit more unique than all the other ones. Of course, I probably have the most unique cards in mine, having all of the the carrion feeders, the ranger captains, recruiters, all that jazz. But thoughts behind why we're playing Hushbringer and Devoted Caretaker and those sorts of cards.
Hushbringer is kind of important to plug up the dockside holes. We are not really hating on artifacts in the ZURe stax list, which is the only list that I currently have Hushbringer in. So one common play pattern people will use to play around stacks is they'll find their dockside, which can enable them to put a lot of things on the board and start valuing out. We really do want to plug those holes. We want to plug up any chance of the Attainted Pact Oracle happening through our rule of law. It stops a bunch of things that are just kind of problematic to us. It does it pretty well.
Right. It's interesting to look at some of the cards that were in several of the lists, but not all of them. And I have to say, I'm proud of you, Cobblepott, for in both of your lists, you included Lavinia.
That's right.
And I'm disappointed Lavinia, in you, Shaper.
And
sorry.
An early Lavinia is very, very powerful. The faster your metagame is, just because of the way that it binds people to their land drops, and the way that it interacts with both Moxen and free counter spells and free interaction. It's very, very disruptive. I don't think it's great as a commander, but it's a great hate bear to drop.
It's a fine commander. Leave me alone. I just need one good blue win con and the deck is golden.
So some of the reason I'm not playing Lavinia is that in a lot of these cases, I personally want people's free interaction to be up. Sometimes it's used to protect their combos, and that's unfortunate. But in any case, it tends to be a 3 versus 1 kind of thing where there are 3 people trying to stop one person from comboing, and if you nuke all of their free interaction, sometimes it'll slip through. Mm-hmm. So I'm not personally a huge fan of doing that without there being some path of recourse for that. I also tend to move to not value super highly stacks pieces that do scale off. I personally I tend to prioritize slots that will kind of do the same thing through the whole game. That's like one of the reasons I don't run Blind Obedience as tech that Cobble's running. Not that those things aren't powerful and don't get you to the point of the game where it is more easy to control the board. It is important to have those kind of early interactive pieces, but it's just not what I had slots for.
How does it feel to be just so horrifically wrong? For those of you who are listening, if you can't tell, I'm being very sarcastic, but
absolutely.
It's interesting here, and this is a card that I want to talk about. I think it's actually underplayed. Is Dark Confidant? Why is nobody else playing Bob?
Mostly, I think because it's a struggle to play him out with one of your early turns and not just die. Mm-hmm. You have to use your early turns to be disruptive, and he gets worse the less turns he can see his trigger. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one of the things holding him back. I think it did make a lot of sense in your Rector build where you're running some things that demand you run some extra creatures. You're running like Culling the Weak and Diabolic Intent. It's not necessary to necessarily run Bob, but having some density of ways to do that I think is good. And I think that a lot of the builds that are playing those kind of cards might be running a few creatures.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I keep seeing people drop Bob from their like mid-range decks, and it blows my mind. I'm like, this is like the best way to gain card advantage.
There are very few 2-mana draw engines in the format.
So looking down here at our sorceries, we're all on Demonic Tutor, Imperial Seal. Looking at some of the more unique sort of things, I'm obviously on Diabolic Intent. I run more creatures than everybody else. But it's interesting to kind of look at where some of the overlap is here. In Shaper, when we kind of look at all these lists and we look at where the overlap lies, what kind of pops out to you as being interesting as far as that goes?
I think Winds of Abandon is one that I think is pretty atypical as of now, but makes sense in the places that we've played it here. Mark Graved and Diabolic Intent also have it's more difficult to put them in the build, but they're very powerful when you are able to enable them.
Right.
I'm proud of us for mostly playing Ponder.
Yeah. I yell at everybody who cuts that card. Nobody, but there's a lot of people who aren't playing, and even both of you have builds that, you're not running Gitaxian Probe, right, Cobble, in either of yours.
Right. This is true.
I think there's something we said about the presence of Esper Sentinel, making it a little more difficult to play Gitaxian Probe for free.
Right.
Right. Also, if you're trying to do a staxier build, especially if Rule of Law is one of your cornerstones, your cantrips are going to be much lower value.
There also is an uptick of Rule of Law because it does tend to hose some of the more fragile builds that are seeing a lot of play.
Mm-hmm.
One sorcery I'd want to emphasize right now is Mnemonic Betrayal. It is very powerful, especially contingent on what your meta is doing. If they're running rituals themselves, sometimes it will just ritual out everybody's graveyard, and that usually just ends the game.
Right.
It also is really interesting that Mnemonic Betrayal gets through Cage, which I'm playing in a lot of builds. So you can play Cage to stop people's breach, and all of their graveyard fuel engines end up fueling your Mnemonic Betrayal, which I think is kind of a powerful way of circumnavigating some of the stuff that's going on.
Right.
Doesn't get around Draneth Magistrate.
No, it does not.
Yeah. Looking at some of the instants here, Cobble, we've got a lot of overlap. Everybody's playing everybody's playing Demonic Consultation. A lot of the stuff that you would see as sort of the common things that you see in a lot of builds like this. Where are the areas in these instant suites that kind of perk your ears up a little bit as being a little more interesting?
One of the things that I like is that every list except for the two stax lists has Mindbreak Trap, which is not something that you would have seen maybe even 6 months ago. It's nice to see that card getting more action, and it's one of those things that's I think been underplayed, and it's cool to see people warming to that card.
I picked mine up just the other day.
Right.
Nice.
A lot of this looks just, it's very stapley, I'll have to say, is, you're in blue and black, a lot of your instants are going to, it's pretty much defined, what everyone's going to be on, a certain set of counter magic. So you're, seeing Force of Will across the, seeing Mental Misstep and seeing Swan Song. Everyone's on Vampiric Tutor. So it's just a lot of this stuff is almost rote, where it's like, well, these are the cards that you play.
So I see that I think 3 of our builds are on Dovin's Veto. 4 of our builds are on Dovin's Veto. How are you guys feeling about that specifically? Kind of in vision of a lot of people deciding that 2-mana counter spells aren't quite where they want to be.
I think Dovin's Veto is really good in Rule of Law. And I think that the color does make it complicated. It makes it harder. It's harder to hold up, 2 specific colors of mana rather than a blue and whatever. So I get why it doesn't see maybe as much play as it could. But the ability to answer something in a way that can't be refuted is just really strong.
I think kind of my feeling on it when I look at the list that I'm going to be playing those sorts of things in is at my 2 mana counter slot. I have been advocating for people to just play counterspell still. Like it sounds crazy. I think Dovin's Veto is very good, but I think right now there is a need for versatile and more general counter magic than there ever has been, because people have been for the past year so greedy with the amount of counter magic that they run and the amount of interaction that they run to the point where people are cutting mana drain from lists. And, I feel like a lot of decks are able to just kind of do whatever they want without a lot of pushback. And so I feel like the issue I have with Dovin's Veto is outside of like Lavinia, outside of maybe ZURe, and I kind of leave it out of here for basically like a density sort of thing, right? It's hard to get white and blue, I feel like. And especially to pay 2 mana for a non-creature counter feels, in my opinion, not as good as just a counter spell, personally.
That's reasonable.
Yeah, a lot of it might depend on what you're facing. If you're facing primarily non-creature win cons, it might become more attractive to say hard no to things like Breach.
Right. That's very true.
I also do want to emphasize something Cobble said, in that it is very good under Rule of Laws.
Yes.
It's a counter that scales really well, and I think that if you're planning on going to turn 4, turn 5, turn 6, you kind of do want at least a few things that can just say hard no.
Right. I think that's fair.
The longer you go, people are going to accumulate more and more protection for whatever win con, and
also not having the counterspell war is actually quite nice. If they know that they are just not going to be able to resolve their thing, they will keep the rest of the counters in their hand and hopefully use them on other things. Right.
It keeps it from being one of those where one player tries to go for it, everyone exhausts their resources, and then the next player wins. Mm-hmm. It helps to balance those situations from happening.
Right. For what it's worth, I'm not saying I think it's bad. I just think that we should probably, as a community in these more interactive decks, maybe consider also playing counterspell. Just because
at least mana drain.
Yeah, like at least mana drain, guys. Like, come on. I don't get it. I really don't. I think that people have, I'm not going to get on this soapbox, but I think people have just gone so far down this ad nauseum rabbit hole to the point where they've completely lost sight of, like, there's other things out there that get played fairly often, and you need to have more versatile interaction than just miscast.
I do think as a result, Stax has kind of bitten back. A lot of these decks aren't the most resilient due to a lot of these kind of cuts and shifts and stuff. Yeah. And always trying to greed over other people's greed. And so sometimes a Stax deck with just a couple pieces can come in and cause a lot of problems.
I mean, I've gone into Turbo Nos metas with Lavinia and like racked up wins. And I've said this before, is I don't feel like a good decks, what I would define as good decks, should not be that easily disrupted by my Lavinia deck. That should not be racking up multiple wins like that. But looking on down as we look at the artifact pieces here, a lot of us are on a lot of the same stuff. The big difference here is there is a decision by both of you guys and all of your lists to play Jeweled Lotus, and I am playing the lightest amount of artifacts in my list. So when we look at Jeweled Lotus, I have a hard time with Jeweled Lotus in these decks, but Cobble, explain Jeweled Lotus in ZURe and really what it does.
I mean, so one of the things that if you're comparing ZURe to a partner pair that has the same colors, the partner pair is going to be more agile because you can get one of those partners out demonstrably faster. You know, a lot of times turn one, you can get one of your partners onto the battlefield. Whereas ZURe can't until you've assembled 3 different colors. Mm-hmm. And Jeweled Lotus is just an extra way to get one of those colors and the colorless mana that you need. So it saves you a turn or 2 in some cases in being able to get ZURe down. And depending on how dependent your list is on having ZURe in play, it makes a big difference.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'll also say that choosing to play ZURe over, say, a 4-color shell or a 5-color shell, choosing to give up colors, especially red right now, does sort of indicate that you want to lean into your commander as a niche. And I think from what I've gathered from doing all this brewing and getting to play ZURe a little bit more, ZURe is incredibly powerful, and just anything that puts him on the board, 2 mana faster and enables you to have 2 mana more, is just sort of really valuable in terms of executing these plans that are built around him. Right.
Mm-hmm. So obviously, we look at some of the decks. Obviously, Zerbag's the only one playing Bag of Holding. But of course, you're playing
maybe a mistake.
What'd you say?
I said maybe a mistake.
With LED, Cobble, you're the only one playing LED. Are you still able to do LED shenanigans with Raz-cats? Like, what is the line with LED in that list?
I mean, the idea is that as long as you have creatures on the battlefield, they're an extension of your hand. So you can use LED to get the mana that you need, and then grab, whatever you need into your hand after doing that with Raz-cats to be able to put together your combo. So it's got flexibility in that manner. It also has flexibility in being a discard outlet in some circumstances because of the fact that this is a reanimator list. Mm-hmm. If you've got Raz-cats in hand or, Elish Norn in hand or one of those sorts of circumstances, there's situations where being able to get those into play or into the graveyard so that you can get them into play is beneficial. And there's also the situation with Chains of Mephistopheles when you've stripped everybody's hands and you don't really care that you're going to discard your hand because you don't have a hand to begin with.
So in the more traditional Raz-cats build, we have a line in which we use Lurrus to recur our LED. We sacrifice Lurrus to Raz-cats to go get a reanimate, which will reanimate Lurrus, allowing us to play LED again. And that lets you loop up mana with your reanimates that are cheaper than 3. Did you consider at all utilizing that line? I know it has.
I did consider Lurrus, and it might be a mistake that I'm not running it because I did consider it for that line and for a couple of other recursion lines that are in that list, but that may be one of the things that I change in the future.
So one thing that I'm noticing about Lurrus in the Raz-cats build is that it's actually very strong with Ranger of Captain Vios and the new Malevolent Hermit, and also Voidwalker. So these hate bears that we're kind of running that let us sacrifice them for some strong value are actually really strong with Lurrus and can kind of help you grind or recur stax pieces that are destroyed. So it might be worth an angle, or it might be an angle worth considering.
For sure.
Interesting. Looking down here at the enchantments, no surprise, every list is playing Necropotence and Rhystic Study. But of course, we look across this, a lot of people Shaper, we've talked about this before, but really, how good is Grasp of Fate in a ZURe list?
Honestly, it's almost essential to me. If ZURe is any central part of your game plan, you really just want to have some kind of removal that will enable you to execute your combo after Necropotence, because you really don't have time to just sit around and dirtle once you actually have a Necropotence on the board and you're burning through your life. So you actually, if there's a removal on play and there's one other piece that's preventing you from doing what you need to do, spending a whole turn cycle removing it is actually, you're taking so much damage doing that. So having a mechanism to remove either critical value engines or stax pieces that exist is just pretty essential to the game plan, I think.
Yeah, and that's a card that we're playing in all of them. And so I feel pretty safe saying I think that it's a ZURe staple, a ZURe essential piece, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like
it should be.
Yeah. Cobble, when you look at these lists and you look at a lot of the similarities, there's some cards that I think they're very interesting that I want to touch on. And one of them is from Shaper's build, which is Artificer's Intuition. And do you think with Artificer's Intuition, is there room for that card, perhaps not only just in a ZURe shell in general, but also perhaps outside of that as being a really strong card to help, enable some of these combos?
Yes, in certain decks. I think that a lot of lists that want to tutor up very specific artifacts have things like Transmute Artifact and, Reshape and, those types of cards were of invention. This, I think, fits very well into ZURe, Artificer's Intuition, just because ZURe can just go find it and then it becomes a toolbox.
Right.
And I think that having such low opportunity cost of just knowing that ZURe can just look it up whenever you need it, if you need to go and get your ballista to end the game, or if you need to go and get a specific answer to a specific threat, having that flexibility is great. And the other lists that would play it, because of its restriction, it's not a survival of the fittest. It's very similar to survival, but it's not quite, because having that limitation of 1 mana is significant.
Right.
So for hate bear lists that are in blue that want to be able to toolbox and want to be able to specify very specific answers to very specific problems, I think that it's useful. I think it's more useful in ZURe just because ZURe can guarantee that you get it.
Right. Looking down here as we kind of wrap things up at the land, the mana bases, everybody's pretty identical. A little bit of difference here or there. But the one thing, Shaper, as we kind of leave here, that I do want to touch on, and I talked about this briefly earlier, is how good Urza Saga really is in these decks.
It's quite strong, especially as a lot of our builds are looking at cards like Grafdigger's Cage, for example. Grafdigger's Cage stops breach combos, and it's kind of, I think, underemphasized how strong the green tutors are, especially at enabling Dockside, Neoform and Eldritch Evolution specifically. Being able to shut off those kind of lines is just really strong, especially if we're not concerned about inhibiting our own win cons or value engines in really many ways at all.
Right.
It's a really flexible card. And our color requirements aren't such that we're too upset about playing a couple colorless utility lands. And being able to pull it on ZURe is just gravy.
Yeah. Well, as you know, that kind of wraps things up here for us today. Shaper, thank you for joining us with this kind of exercise in brewing. What were kind of some of your takeaways from it?
ZURe is still really powerful.
Would you say it's an A tier commander?
Absolutely. I may put it together in paper myself.
Yeah.
I have a
think
really
this
nice
is
artist
cool.
proof that I absolutely would love to use again.
Oh, that's awesome. Cobble, what was kind of your takeaway from this exercise?
Very much the same. I think the misconception that ZURe is outmodded because it doesn't have red or because it's a 3-mana commander or a 3-color commander. Those rationalizations don't hold up. And I think that, so normally when we do these Brewers Corners, there's only, each of us does one list, and Shaper's like, well, I've got 4. so I was like, okay, I'll make 2. And, just the breadth of approaches that we have here.
Right.
I mean, we have the quasi turbo. We got a couple of stacks. There's a rector list. There's a taking turns list. There's, a shift deck. The fact that we can use ZURe in so many different ways, and this was just us over, like a week coming up with different ideas. It reveals that there's a lot of exploration maybe that people haven't taken, and there's new directions that we can maybe push ZURe that could challenge the metagame in interesting ways.
Right. Well, I am really excited to see if people start brewing a little bit, and I'm excited to see where our brews go. Shaper, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come and hang out with us and talk about ZURe. As far as stuff that you're doing right now, what's going on? What are some things that you're up to in the community?
Right now we are, right now we're working on expanding our leagues, on the cEDH server. We have virtual LGS every week. We have lots of events. Come check us out. I'm also working on Conquest stuff. We're going strong. We are on season 4 of our leagues now. It's been a lot of fun. There's a lot of variety. I'm also working on tons of different cEDH brews kind of behind the scenes. I'm really excited about Hermit Druid right now. It seems like every list that I have sticks in Hermit Druid. But I'm hoping to publish some stuff on that pretty soon. We're just vibing mostly.
Awesome.
Do those lists run 2 different hermits?
They do. Most of them do.
Mm-hmm. I have been seeing people doing Sans Black Hermit Druid lists, and those
I've been pushing that pretty hard. You may have seen my Paco Druid list.
I have. I saw an Akira. Well, I think it was Thrasios Bruce Hermit Druid list that was running around, and it's very interesting to watch how people are really getting excited to brew around a lot of different stuff. Cobble, I don't know about you, and I don't know about you, Shaper, but I love brewing. So
yeah, absolutely.
But yeah.
So outside of Black, would those be using Savian's Reclamation?
Sometimes I actually, I really like just running Memory's Journey into either Thassa's Oracle or Breach. You can also play as up to 3 copies of Memory's Journey for redundancy. It basically enables you to circumvent the need for Narcomoeba and that sort of thing.
Right.
There's also, I guess I'll just spoil it. There's an optimization to what I would consider like the fastest Hermit Druid pile. Normally what you would do is you would mill your deck, you have Hermit Druid in play, a Narcomoeba comes out of your deck, and you either unearth a Fate Stitcher or play a land to reanimate a Bloodghast, which gives you the 3 creatures that you need to Dread Return. So really, Fate Stitcher tends to be the pick because Bloodghast is a little bit inconsistent. So the pile ends up costing green and blue to execute the Hermit Druid activation and the Fate Stitcher unearth. Then you can Dread Return. With what we have right now, if you mill out with Hermit Druid on your upkeep and you Memory's Journey back a reanimate, your pile just costs green black, and you're not really playing any of the kind of accessory cards like Narcomoeba, so you can keep your your card quality really high, while also enabling really fast Hermit Druid piles.
That's awesome.
Interesting. Well, I'm excited to see where all this goes. Excited to see the list and all of that. But thank you so much for coming on. It was an absolute pleasure. You're one of the legends.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great having you.
Well, that about wraps things up for us here today. Just a quick reminder that you can follow us on Twitter at SculptyBoys, BOIS, or you can find a direct link to our Twitter accounts in the link tree in the description below. You can also find a direct link to all of our Mox fields, all of the Sculpty Boy Mox fields. So if you want to keep up on what we're working on, you can check that out down there as well. I want to also give an extra shout out to all of our patrons who help keep the lights on. If you too would like to become a patron, you can head on over to patreon.com/The Mind Sculptors or check out the link in the description. Also, make sure to hit the like button, help the algorithm out. We would greatly appreciate that. And thanks to everybody who has supported us through everything. Really appreciate you. Thanks again for joining us, and from all of us here at the Mind Sculptors, I'm Callahan, and we'll see you next time.
I'm in line with the stars, I'm in sync with the earth. 10 toes deep, flower child from the turf. I never switch sides, like even when I die, I'm a ride for the squad, ladder ties in the hearse. I've been on the vibe, kinda hard to describe. I'm in between, I'm good and it's fine, but I'm tired of the grind. Then I come alive in the night to realize I'm in the middle of the time of my life. I never so packed for the stack, never lied on the rap. Got a bag from the way that I write it. Queen looking Tyson, do that ass survive, doing 80 to the house. Then I hit it to the sky, change haters on a tirade. Talking to the crib in the face, be still like I hate stuff fade. We all want the same, we all want a meal in the safe. I wanna live like I'm trying to reach enlightenment. Trail spill from my lips, feel big from the bib. Take a sip till I pass out. Try and get grit, but it don't make sense. Cause you can lose life on this fast route. Yeah, turn thoughts to a cash cow. I might flip that to the glass house. I don't need the accolades, I'm in love with the chase. I just wanna eat, save a spot at the table. Beats with the slap, hit myself on the map. You long with the wind, but we knowing that it's capped. 5-hour flights, couple nights at the flat. To be real, couldn't see me making moves while I'm at. I'm still on the grind, limit time when I chat. I'm burning down sage, keep the demons away. When I write it, give a piece of myself to the page. I don't do it for the